Back in 2023, the United Kingdom quietly made electronic trade documents legally equivalent to paper. It wasn't a headline moment, but it changed what institutions are allowed to automate. And it exposed a disconnect most people still miss. The system that creates an obligation is not the same system that settles it. Trade finance is often described as if it's just a complicated payment. Money needs to move from buyer to seller across borders, with a few extra steps in between. So in crypto, the instinct is to ask which network can move value fastest, cheapest, or with the most uptime. That instinct feels logical, but it skips over how trade finance actually works. Trade finance is not one action. It's a sequence of obligations, conditions, and proofs that determine when money is even allowed to move in the first place. The payment is the final step, not the system itself. Most of the friction in trade finance doesn't live in settlement rails. It lives in documents, in title transfer, in compliance checks, and in the legal recognition of who owns what and when. If those pieces aren't resolved, the fastest settlement network in the world doesn't matter. This is where confusion sets in. Viewers are told to compare chains as if they're competing to do the same job, when in reality, institutions decompose the job into layers. This episode is about mapping those layers and understanding why different networks are being pulled toward different roles inside the same institutional workflow. Everything here is for educational and entertainment purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. If clear, no hype crypto education helps you make sense of all this. Hit like and subscribe. It tells YouTube this series is worth showing to other newcomers, and it helps me keep building it for you. When most people hear the word settlement, they think of value moving from one account to another. In institutional finance, settlement means something more specific. It's the moment risk collapses. It's when an obligation becomes final and exposure disappears. That distinction matters, because trade finance is full of situations where settlement cannot happen yet, not because the rails are slow, but because the conditions haven't been satisfied. Documents may be incomplete. Title may not have transferred. A compliance window may still be open. A shipment may not be verified. Until those conditions resolve, institutions are not allowed to settle. This is why treating trade finance as a pure settlement problem leads to bad conclusions. The system that decides whether settlement is permitted is just as important as the system that executes it. So instead of asking which chain wins, the better question is where each system fits in the sequence that takes a transaction from obligation to finality. At a high level, trade finance breaks into three functional layers. The first is the obligation layer. This is where rights and responsibilities are created. It's where invoices, bills of lading, guarantees, and other trade documents establish who owes what, under what conditions. The second is the risk and financing layer. This is where institutions decide whether to fund those obligations, discount them, insure them, or distribute them. This layer prices risk and determines capital treatment. The third is the settlement layer. This is where funds actually move and exposure collapses. A single network can be technically capable of touching all three layers. That doesn't mean institutions want it to. Separation reduces legal ambiguity, limits blast radius, and allows components to be swapped without rebuilding the entire system. This is why institutional finance is built in stacks, not monoliths. Understanding this structure is the key to understanding why XRP and XDC don't automatically collide, even though they're both blockchains. For decades, trade finance has been constrained by one stubborn requirement: paper. In many jurisdictions, the physical document wasn't just tradition, it was part of what made the right enforceable. Possession, endorsement, and transfer were tied to paper by law. In 2023, the UK changed that. By recognizing electronic trade documents as legally equivalent to paper, it removed a structural blocker that had kept digital trade workflows fragile. The law didn't adopt a blockchain, and it didn't mandate a technology stack. What it did was more foundational. It allowed the obligation layer itself to become digital, without collapsing back into paper at the moment of enforcement. That change didn't immediately transform global trade, but it created a new design space, and design space is where infrastructure competition actually begins. This is where XDC enters the picture in a precise way. XDC's ecosystem has consistently emphasized trade finance workflows, particularly around digitizing, recording, and distributing trade instruments and documents. That emphasis aligns with the obligation layer of the stack, not primarily the settlement layer. Once electronic trade documents became legally usable, systems built around managing those documents became more viable. Not because they were selected by regulators, but because their architecture matched what institutions were now permitted to do. This doesn't mean XDC is the trade finance chain. It means its center of gravity is visibly oriented toward document-heavy workflows, where enforceability and auditability matter as much as speed. It's also why technical phrases like ISO 20022 are often misunderstood. Structured messaging helps systems communicate, but messaging alone doesn't determine legal finality. The real value is in making obligations machine-readable and operationally usable across institutional workflows. Seen this way, XDC aligns naturally with the obligation layer of trade finance, while settlement decisions can remain separate, depending on corridor, liquidity, and policy constraints. Once obligations are digitized and conditions are met, the institutional bottleneck shifts. It moves to settlement. Settlement is where liquidity is consumed or released. It's where exposure windows close. And in cross-border finance, settlement isn't one thing. It can be bank money, a stablecoin, a tokenized deposit, or a bridge asset, depending on corridor rules and regulatory constraints. This is where XRP's role becomes clear without claiming inevitability. XRP has been positioned around settlement and liquidity routing, not document creation. Its value proposition centers on reducing the time capital remains trapped in transit once settlement is permitted. Could XDC settle value on its own? Technically, yes. Any ledger can settle its native asset. The institutional question is not capability. It's preference under constraint. When institutions choose settlement rails, they prioritize liquidity depth, regulatory fit, treasury integration, and real-time reconciliation. That's why settlement is where standards tighten, and why not every technically capable network is selected. When these layers coexist, the connection point is not a token swap. It's a policy-driven instruction. A trade obligation is created. Documents are validated. Compliance gates clear. Financing terms lock in. Only then does the system emit an instruction to settle, specifying who gets paid, under what conditions, and with what audit trail attached. At that point, the settlement rail doesn't need the full history. It needs to trust the instruction and execute finality. This is how institutions preserve control while gaining efficiency. This is also why modular stacks dominate institutional design. No single vendor controls every layer. Each component proves itself where it specializes, and the handoff is governed by policy, not ideology. This framing also explains why Ripple's broader stack matters. Institutions don't adopt tokens alone. They adopt custody, compliance controls, treasury orchestration, and settlement rails that operate as a coherent system. From here, three realistic worlds emerge. In one, coexistence becomes normal. Trade document systems handle obligations and proofs. Settlement occurs on rails chosen per corridor, sometimes using bank money, sometimes stable dollars, sometimes bridge assets. The winners are components, not chains. In another, consolidation occurs. A tightly integrated stack captures more of the pipeline end-to-end. This requires trust across legal, operational, and liquidity dimensions. It's possible, but far harder than most narratives imply. In the third, routing dominates. Institutions treat ledgers as networks, not religions. They route based on permissions, cost, liquidity, and risk. This world already resembles how global finance operates today. These outcomes can coexist across jurisdictions and use cases at the same time. Step back and the contrast becomes clear. The most important shifts in institutional crypto aren't driven by hype or price. They're driven by legal recognition, workflow design, and where risk is concentrated. Trade finance is a document problem before it's a settlement problem. When the law adjusted in 2023, it allowed that reality to surface. Some networks are naturally pulled toward obligations, others toward finality. Institutions assemble stacks that reflect that separation. If you want to understand where XRP and XDC fit, the disciplined approach is also the most realistic. Follow the workflow. Follow the permissions. Follow the incentives. Because institutional finance won't be rebuilt by one chain winning everything. It will be rebuilt by systems quietly becoming indispensable, one layer at a time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. This channel is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and is not financial advice. Always do your own research and keep the discussion respectful. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with a friend.